My name's Ken Nowak. I am with the Lower Colorado region of the Bureau of Reclamation out of Boulder City, Nevada, actually, but I'm stationed attached to the University of Colorado with a handful of folks from the Bureau of Reclamation who focus on Colorado River modeling. So I'm really pleased to be here today, and I just want to thank the district for hosting this event and you all for having me here today. You know, I was asked here to talk about this agricultural work group that has been alluded to in a couple of different talks already today. And before I get into that, I just want to start with a disclaimer and perhaps a few reflections from my experience in this work group. I don't have an agricultural background, and so I'm first of all, want to just thank all the folks who were on that work group who were just a tremendous source of knowledge and that were willing to share it with someone like me. And I feel like I learned and benefited a whole lot from being part of that team, and there were some really top-notch folks out there. Time and again, when we were having discussions in this work group, we heard that agricultural water use has a target on its back, and sometimes it was said explicitly that way, and other times in different words, but ultimately the sentiment, you know, was very pervasive in our discussion. And I don't think anyone here needs to be reminded that we've got a lot of challenges in this basin. We heard about them in terms of the hydrology being below average the past 16 years and how demands are only going to continue to increase. And I think it's important to recognize that it's demands not just for municipal use, but also demands for agricultural and ranching products that rely on water supply. And so those aren't going away. And so with that backdrop, you can imagine that it might not be easy to have a discussion about additional agricultural water conservation, but we did have a really good group of people come together and have some pretty good discussions, I could say. And I think it has to do with, you know, as I got to know these folks over 2-3 years, that it's a recognition of, it's more than just a water supply and some plumbing, but it's really water that is fundamental to communities, economies, and cultures across the Southwest, and it's really important, and it's so important it ought to be talked about even if those discussions are a little bit difficult. And so for that I'm very thankful, and we have a long list of participants on this effort, as well as 2 other co-chairs, which I'm not going to list because there are so many, but I just want to thank them and recognize them. So where did this moving forward in this agricultural work group come from? So to get at that, I'd just like to start with a little bit of background. Again, it's been alluded to in some of the other talks already today, so a little bit of the same material, but hopefully it helps set the stage and refresh you if you've forgotten some of it after that delicious lunch. So we start with the Colorado River Basin study. You've seen this plot in this form and in another form, and it's really the infamous figure. We probably generated hundreds, if not 1,000 or so figures in that study, and this is the one that everyone goes to. And so the Basin study was really looking to do 2 things. The first was to look at long-term supply and demand imbalances on the basin, and then the second was to look at ways that you might be able to mitigate those effects and build some resiliency in the system. The study wrapped up in 2012. It was Reclamation in the 7 states working with partners across the basin. And what we found was that going forward, there's potential for some serious imbalances. You can see it here. Out to 2060, the supply and demand gap widens quite a bit, and it actually ranges from about 0, so an almost balanced system, to a pretty heavy deficit, as many as 7 million acre feet per year. And if you focus on that middle of the road, it's about 3.2 million acre feet. That's a number that seems to get thrown around a lot. But the second half, again, is looking at ways to potentially build some resiliency, some opportunities to close that gap, possibly. And so what we did was we put together some portfolios of options that represent the sentiment that there's no silver bullet to solving this problem, but if you put together a bunch of good ideas and package them up right, that you might get some silver buckshot and you can really make some difference. And so that was how we approached it. It wasn't meant to be an intended solution to the problem, but just demonstrating that there's different ways to package together these options and strategies and get some reduction in terms of vulnerability. And so, as I mentioned, we had these options that got submitted to the study. We actually had a public solicitation period. We got 150 submissions of people's ideas about what to do in terms of this supply and demand imbalance. And not surprisingly, we got some related to agricultural water use. And in fact, the surprising thing was that there was only 9 of that 150 or so that got submitted. But as we did with all these options that got submitted, we did some processing. We grouped like submissions together, we standardized things, we made some assumptions, and then we ended up with a number, which ended up being about 1 million acre-feet of potential agricultural water savings out to 2060. And so, again, not surprising was that there was a variety of views on how realistic that number was. Some people said there's no way that would ever be done. You'd have to fallow so much land that it just wouldn't happen. It's not realistic. And then others said, well, geez, agricultural water use is such a big piece of the pie in the Colorado that 1 million doesn't seem so crazy. And so what we recognized with regards to things like this and a couple other things in the study was that we weren't going to get to everything in the study, and we had to tie it off at some point. And so some of these topics needed further investigation with the right folks who have the expertise, and also get into the details a little bit. And so that's really sort of, in my mind, the genesis of this moving forward effort was an opportunity to really dive into the weeds on some of these potential areas where we can make some inroads and some potential for further investigation. You saw a similar slide, similar graphic earlier. We had 3 work groups, one focusing on M&I use, one on ag use, and then one on ecological and recreational flows. The effort was initiated back in 2013, and we had these 3 work groups as well as a coordination team that was helping keep them all in line and give them some guidance. And really the important thing to note here is they brought together a set of stakeholders that were different than the Basin study, but also provided the expertise to address questions about, you know, is 1 million acre-feet of agricultural conservation something that is realistic, or what would that look like, and so on and so forth. And so we were really fortunate to be able to get into some detail that we did not in the Basin study. So just a quick plug here, the effort did put out a phase 1 report in May of this year. It has 6 chapters with each work group contributing a chapter, as well as some wrapper chapters put together by that coordination team. Each chapter is a standalone product of each work group, so what you're seeing is the agricultural work group's views, not influenced by either of the other 2 work groups, and vice versa if you follow that. And anyway, the CH2M Hill was our contractor that helped us with this, and they were invaluable in terms of putting this thing together and getting it done, so I want to recognize them. But this is available. If you just search Moving Forward, you'll find this and you can take a look. And so really I'm here today to talk specifically about the agricultural work group chapter 4. And we had a pretty lengthy scope, to be truthful, but it's kind of distilled here into 3 talking points. The first is looking at conservation efficiency and transfers that have occurred to date in the agricultural sector. The second is looking at and identifying existing plans and agreements or potential future opportunities for programs. And then last, looking at issues or challenges related to these types of things. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that first bullet, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. There's a lot of anecdotal as well as qualitative discussion about how agricultural water use and efficiency has improved in the basin over time. And so we really wanted to get at that and try and explain it and make it as quantitative as possible. And so to that end, I think one of the things we first did was we added productivity to this title, because one of the things that was recognized right off the bat is that you can use water better, but it may not free up water. It's just going to increase your productivity, which is an excellent outcome that needs to be recognized. And so we wanted to get that front and center in the title. And so that was the kind of discussion we were having. And so one of the things that we did was we started some pretty intense data collection, both from resources that are available from USDA, from Reclamation, from the states, as well as getting data directly from folks involved with our work group. And so here's a map showing agriculture served by the Colorado River. You can see it extends beyond the hydrologic boundaries. We all know that. And you know, one of the things we found is, as we were going through collecting these data, trying to come up with this quantitative way to tell the story of agricultural water use improving over time, we found that it's really hard to do because there's a lot of different areas, and the data have different lengths. They're reported differently. They have different geographic areas by which they're categorized and reported. And it was not an easy task, to say the least. And so it's not meant to be a criticism by any means of folks reporting or how things are done. It's just recognizing this is a a big basin with a long history and a lot of agriculture, and so that was what we were wrestling with. And so we tried our best to get at this, and it's just important to recognize that it's not a simple just crunch the numbers sort of thing and show the trend. And so to further kind of get at just the difficulty, maybe not difficulty, but the types of discussions we were having, even with folks who are really experts in this field, we would get various definitions depending on who you asked about what agricultural water conservation means. There's definitely some overlap in these different definitions, if you will, but who you ask gets you a different answer. And so again, that's reflective of the diverse agriculture as well as the large geographic extent in this basin. So we saw things like decreased crop consumptive use, that was conservation. Improved application efficiency, that was conservation. People talked about productivity as being conservation, that's an outcome of conservation. Increased irrigation, diversion, delivery efficiency, so getting water to the farms more efficiently, that was conservation. And then also better utilization of precipitation, and then better controlling evap through using new technologies and application approaches. And so again, this is just the kind of context of the discussion we're having. This is not an easy thing to wrangle, and so it took quite a bit of effort to come up with ways to show that agricultural water use is definitely changed over time in this basin. And so I'm trying to just give you a glimpse into some of the discussions we had here. But we did try and get at it in a couple of different ways, and I want to share 2 or 3 of them here with you today and some reflections on that. So one way we got at this was with case studies, and we found that speaking in generalities similar to the different definitions of conservation was not always productive, because generalities leave a lot to be said, and oftentimes there was confusion about, well, that's what this means in the lower basin, but it doesn't necessarily apply to the upper basin, or that applies in Utah, but it may be different in Colorado. And so case studies allowed us to really sink our teeth into specific examples and other things that really help to highlight how agricultural water use has changed and the efficiency improvements and investments that have occurred, and even do a little bit of, I'll call it myth busting for lack of a better term. And so one of those myths that we talked about was that as you become more effective at applying water, you need less water. And there's a study in New Mexico, it's one of our case studies here, that actually showed that, at least as I understand it, that as you more effectively provide a crop or a plant water, it grows better and it grows bigger. And then overall it needs more water over that growing season. And so you can actually see for certain crops and areas increases in water use and demand as you become more efficient and effective. And so it was things like that we talked about, where these large generalities of if we can just be more efficient or effective, we'll have freed up water, that just didn't resonate with folks. And so the case studies were one of those ways that we were able to get at that a little bit. All right, so one of the things we did was we tried to get at this issue of how has water use changed over time, and we had a tough time getting at it, because really to do this you needed a couple things, at least the way we were approaching it. You needed information about irrigated acreage, you needed information about your consumptive use, and you needed information about productivity, and you need to make sure you had it for all 3 in the same area, reported in the same way over a period that was long enough that you could actually do some analysis on, and that doesn't always happen. And so we went through a lot of effort, and what we came up with is this figure, and I'm going to attempt to explain it to you here. The yellow and the green lines are irrigated acres and consumptive use respectively. And what this represents is not the entire basin, and not the entire upper basin, and not the entire lower basin, but a good chunk of those areas. And so we called it representative. It's a fair amount of water. You can see on the left there, it's about 6 million acre feet represented in terms of consumptive use. So that's a fair amount of water. We don't feel like we're just focusing in on one field or 1 acre or something like that. And those 2 lines are pretty flat over time. There's definitely some averaging. There's a little bit of a window 5-year average going on here to help smooth things out. But going back to 1980 or so, we see that the acres under production have stayed pretty flat, and then also that the consumptive use has stayed flat. What we did get at was this idea of productivity, and it's going up. and that's the black line. And the way we got at productivity was we looked at all the different crops that were being grown and their tons per acre, and we compared it to previous years and looked at how did they change. So if your alfalfa was X tons per acre in the 1980s, and then by 1990 it was up by 10%, you know, we could track that going along. And what we did was we looked at the percent change of all the different crops for which we could get data. So now you've got all these different crops going up and down. And then for each year, we adjusted it based on the number of acres in production. So that way, if your alfalfa jumped in a big way in terms of your yields, but it was only a small fraction of the total acreage in production, it didn't skew your results to a huge jump. And I apologize if that's hard to follow, but that was the best way that we could try and account for looking at how productivity was changing, and then also keeping in consideration the number of acres that that's representing. And so what we find here is that the trend goes up, and we see about a 25% increase in productivity across the upper and lower basins over the past 30 years roughly. And one of the more interesting things is there's this dip, and you see it around, I don't know, 2004, 2005. And so we spent some time looking into it, and if you separate this out into an upper and lower basin version, you'd see that the dip is more pronounced in the upper basin and it doesn't exist in the lower basin. And what that is, it's the drought, the early 2000s, where we saw such severe reductions in precipitation. The upper basin suffered more so and was impacted actually in terms of their productivity, but the lower basin wasn't. And so we actually spent some time diving into this. And what we found is that in the lower basin, their precipitation on their irrigated agriculture is so little. It's like 2 to 3% of the total water applied, if you will. That it doesn't make a difference if it's dry or if it's wet, because it's not a fraction that's important. But in the upper basin, it's something about 15% of what I'll call the total applied water is that direct precipitation, that antecedent soil moisture you get from a good winter. And so if you have a bad year or a bad string of years, you lose 15% perhaps of the amount of water that would have been available to you. And so you see that impacting productivity. And so that was our hypothesis, and we went through some analysis that's in the study, and I think we fleshed it out pretty well. I'll truthfully say the one question we did get that we couldn't answer super well is that why didn't consumptive use drop? There was definitely reductions in consumptive use in the upper basin associated with the drought in the early 2000s. And when we looked at different data sets, some of them were flatter, some of them showed a decline. And so unfortunately, the data set that we're using here didn't really show much of an impact on consumptive use. My personal hypothesis is that it's a combination of the fact that there's some smoothing going along that green line, and so that's smoothing it out, and then also that those impacts to consumptive use didn't happen all at once in a given year. And so maybe the Green River Basin in Utah there was impacted earlier or later than the Gunnison. And so by stretching those reductions out in consumptive use, you don't see a market decline so much as what you see in terms of the productivity. But ultimately, what we see here is I think, the story that we were hearing anecdotally and qualitatively told in a fairly quantitative manner. And so I think this is a great outcome. And we spend a lot of time working on this, and so I'm pleased to share this, and hopefully it tells a story that resonates with you all as well. So a few concluding remarks from our report. We spent all this effort documenting and trying to tell the story of how agricultural water use has improved over time and how it's become more efficient and more productive. But I don't think that target's going away. It's still a target on the back of agricultural water use. And so what we did to conclude this report was we put together some opportunities, and then for each opportunity underneath it, some more specific actions that can help to improve and continue the trends in terms of this more effective, efficient use of water, increasing productivity that we just saw in the previous slide. And so we tried to craft these in a way that's respectful of tradition and existing water use, but also with an eye on what the future likely holds and what we're going to have to wrestle with as we go forward. And so the broad categories of those opportunities are shown here. A lot of them stem from past successes, but some of them have more to do with newer emerging opportunities. So we had some very good discussions on these topics, and you can see some of them are just related to conveyance. That's a big thing in the lower basin, especially for out of basin transfers. but then also other things like flexible water management, enhanced soil health, and things like just getting more data and information out so that an analysis like this or other analyses to help discussions can be done a little easier. So just a few closing thoughts of my own here. You can see the list of not the work group members, but at least the entities they represent, and there are quite a few. So, I think it's important to recognize that significant investments have occurred to date. Some of those are done in terms of trying to improve productivity. Some of them are done to make more water available for agriculture or other uses for that matter. And that the future is likely to be pretty challenging, but that if we build on past successes and work in a more collaborative manner, I think there's some real opportunities there. The last thing I'll just say is that these opportunities are, I think they're great. I think they're well documented. I think they've got a lot behind them. But ultimately, the effectiveness of them and how well they're capitalized on depends on momentum and support that's built by partnerships and events like this. And so I just want to really congratulate and thank the district for hosting this event, because it keeps that discussion and momentum going, and just, reports that sit on shelves don't necessarily always get the job done. And so, with that, I'd just like to thank everyone again, and be willing to take any questions if there are any.
Questions? Question in the front, Steve.
Well, there's a lot of reasons for increases in productivity over the course of the last 30 years that are probably not related to irrigation management, such as improved genetics of crops, for one, better knowledge of soil management, better knowledge of cropping systems, more educated producers on the ground, applying more modern technologies that may not be related to water issues. How did your analysis sort out all these other reasons for increased crop productivity to come to your conclusion?
That's a great point. And, what I didn't show on that figure is that there's a monster disclaimer below it that goes into how we calculated it, and that it's representative, and that, there's all these other factors, just like you're talking about, that can influence them. And we actually talked about those in the report. I think what it gets at, regardless of whether or not it's because you're using the water more effectively, genetics, soil health, like you mentioned, you're using a certain amount of water and you're getting more crop, or you're getting whatever the case may be. And that's important, because those yields increasing represent an increased benefit for a given amount of water that's applied. And so we talked a lot about how do you increase the productivity in ways that may not be necessarily tied to water use in a traditional sense, but when you do the arithmetic of tons per acre per water applied, it goes up, and we thought that was a good finding. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Another question. I would certainly venture that the great majority of crop productivity in the last 30 years has been for reasons other than any difference in water usage.
And I think that probably applies across the basin. In some cases, what we were hearing from, especially in the lower basin, the irrigators, the switch to double and triple cropping and some more advanced scheduling techniques have allowed them to keep a third crop in when they were previously only doing two. And so I think it's a blend, to be totally honest. But again, I'm just going off of what we heard from our work group members more than anything that I truly know myself.
Seeing no more questions, let's give our speaker a hand. Thank you, Ken. Good job.